I was born in Johannesburg on 1st September 1928 into a household comprising my mother, Minnie, my father, Philip, my 4-year-old sister, Edna, and, it being in South Africa, black servants and even some white nannies, some of whom I dearly loved and some of whom I did not. Minnie was born in Bolton, England, but both families were immigrants escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe. Our background was, of course, Jewish. My mother was conventionally religious and would trot me along to the nearby synagogue some Saturdays and on the high holidays. My father was at one time Orthodox and took religion very serious. He ran a soap factory, which was not doing very well, so he had to work long hours and often slept on the premises overnight in a camp bed. One night, having said his prayers and laid himself down sometime well after midnight, a metal object worked loose in the wind-battered roof, dropped down and fell into his right eye, from which he lost his sight permanently. As a result, or so the story goes, he decided that there was nothing in this prayer business after all, and became a convinced and articulate skeptic. I'm sorry to say that I followed in his footsteps in a very juvenile way. I'd been going through a period at one time, was about 9, I think, of thinking, oh yes, I must say my prayers, that's very good, and I will become a very good Jew, and etc. And I would say my prayers morning and evening, and then one morning I caught the bus down to school, and being late, as I always am, my wife will confirm, I had to run to get there in time, which I did. But this time I tripped over something, and in my short pants I grazed my knees, something horrible. Nothing serious, but it hurt a lot. And I'm afraid I followed in my father's footsteps and thought, there's nothing much in this prayer business after all. And I've never really changed my mind too much after that. I also remember Father saying to me, having a discussion with him once along the same lines. And I must have averred that, I think I asked him, well, if there's no God, who made the world? And his reply was, well, if God made the world, who made God? And somehow that resonated, and began to think and have thought ever since that day that, well, life and everything is a great mystery. And if you introduce God to explain it all, you're just replacing one mystery with another. And I'm afraid that's where I've stood ever since.
Your father died in 1939, the year the war broke out. You were age 11 or thereabouts. What happened then?
That was I'm afraid it's a very sad story. As I said, the soap factory was not doing too well. And in 1939, one of the big manufacturers of cosmetics and soap, Lever Brothers, I think they must have decided to put all the small people out of business. At any rate, they cut their prices to an extent that they could only sell at a loss, which they could stand. My father couldn't. So towards September 1939, he was really facing bankruptcy. And he decided, and I suppose was dreadfully depressed. And he must have decided to do something which is, well, he must have decided to commit suicide in a way that he hoped would deceive the insurance company into believing that it wasn't suicide. And what he planned was asphyxiation by car exhaust, by shutting himself in the car garage with the engine running. But something went wrong and the car caught fire, and the result killed him, but it wasn't a pleasant way. And it didn't convince the insurance company. But my mother was left destitute and in a bad state. And my sister and I were sent to live with aunt's sister in Pretoria, myself in Springs. And, well, that was the end of my father.
When the war broke out, were you aware of it in Johannesburg, or did it Pretoria?
I was in Springs by that time.
Yeah.
I was certainly aware of it because my uncle with whom I was living, had volunteered for the South African Army. But he got injured on a training exercise, so was invalided out. But then ran a factory making various war materials in Johannesburg for a while. But we continued to stay in Springs, where my cousin and I duly misbehaved in many ways, too tedious to go into, I think.
Then after the war, or maybe during the war, you became involved in a violinist movement, did you?
Indeed. After 2 years in Springs, my mother had re-established herself by selling insurance, actually, to the point that she was able to afford a flat and have me come back to her. I suppose because I was the youngest, she could only take one. She took me. And while in Johannesburg, I went back to my old school and met some old friends. The school, like many institutions in South Africa, was pretty anti-Semitic. I remember one day the head saying Jewish boys should remain behind, and he gave us a lecture about how we didn't perform enough on the sports field and too much in the academic area, but be that as it may, etc. But amongst my friends, who were mostly, but not all Jewish at that time, some of them were members of a scouting movement, a Jewish scouting movement. In fact, one started by a left-wing, it was a left-wing Zionist youth organization, and we did all the things scouts do, went on a lot of camping and so on. But the idea was that eventually they wished that we would go and settle on a kibbutz in Israel. And so I did join this movement and did lots of all the usual things. And indeed, in losing track of the dates now, but I went to university at a very early age, 16, which was ridiculous, really. But after half a year of doing engineering, I changed my mind and went instead to the training farm run by this youth movement, where I spent 6 months and discovered that I didn't think that I was really cut out to be a farmer, which had a sequel too. But at any rate, that's what I did then. But my sister had by that time, she was older than me, and she'd taken up with a certain Duncan Linney, who was a Trotskyist. So being little brother, I trotted on her heels and duly became a Trotskyist too. I didn't have much understanding of what it was about, though I did actually dip a little bit into Das Kapital. I read several pages. And I realized after a while that what Trotskyism really meant was that you were all for socialism, communism, but you were against the Communist Party and against Stalinism, which strikes me as not such a bad mixture. And in particular in South Africa, you were very much against apartheid. And well, even as a kid, I went on many demonstrations, sometimes at this time, sometimes at that. And so that took me in Johannesburg till 1948. But in the 2 years, 1946 to 48, my mother had contracted progressive muscular dystrophy, and she died after 2 years. So that was the end of my parental family, but I always stayed close to my sister, even when I wasn't with her.
So in 1948, age 20, you made the decision to go to Israel.
No, it was a bit later than that. You're right. But at age 18, I think, yes, after my mother died, I then went down to Cape Town and re-enlisted in university, this time to do geology, physics, and chemistry. At none of those subjects was I a great success. However, I sort of scraped by. But the important thing about Cape Town, of course, is Table Mountain, which I discovered that I really love mountains. Not only Table Mountains, but the Hex River Mountains, which are about 60 to 80 miles outside of Cape Town, which are high enough, even in the southern tip of Africa, have snow in winter, and the university had a ski club with a hut on the mountains there. And so began a different way of life, which I think I preferred at the time to the university side. But it has been part of my life, I suppose, until recently, ever since.
Yeah, mountain. So upper climbing becomes a big theme in your.
It was, yes. And of course, on Table Mountain, I really learned to rock climb and did the whole caper.
Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, Paul, in 1948, well, at that time, Israel was seeking to establish itself. Now, today we think of Israel in other lights. But in those days, Israel was the last hope for hundreds of thousands, millions of refugees who had survived the Holocaust and didn't know where to go. And the prospect of being able to go to Israel was what mattered to them and which gave impetus to the creation of the State of Israel. Palestine was then a British colony, but the rebellious potential Israelis and the rebellious Palestinians made life difficult for Britain. Britain opted out, handed over to the United Nations, which decreed that there should be a two-state Palestine, well, two states, one Israel, one Palestine. But the Israel one was objected to, probably soundly, rightly, by the Palestinians, but rightly or wrongly, it fought for its existence and it had to fight hard because while Israel now is militarily dominant, it was then embryo and facing Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. And although I had lost contact with the Zionist youth movement by that time, I felt that I had to go and volunteer, do something. Well, there was an office in Johannesburg where Israel was recruiting volunteers. So I popped along there and said, "Take me." They said, "What can you do?" Well, I said, "Nothing." So they said, "Go away." Well, but I thought about that a bit and I said, "Well, wait a minute. If I had a pilot's license, would you take me?" I said, "Yes." So I got myself a job in a nightclub waiting, got some money, enrolled on a elementary flying course, and within 2 months, maybe it was 3, I had a license to fly tiger moths. Now, a tiger moth might not mean very much to the audience here, but if you'd lived at that time in anywhere around a military training ground, you would see in the air a small biplane with 2 cockpits, which was very acrobatic. It couldn't go very fast. It was a brilliant training machine. That's what I learned to fly on. And I was so proud of myself to fly this thing. I remember inviting a friend called Marge Clouts to come and have a flight with me. She said, "Oh, yes," she came along. So I duly took off with Marge, me in the front seat, she in the back. And I said, "Would you like to do some aerobatics?" And she said, "Oh, yes." So I said, "Fine." And we did this and they did that. Then I said, "Would you like to do a loop-the-loop?" She said, "Oh, yes." So I duly did a loop-the-loop, as a result of which I began to feel very airsick. I said to Marge, "I think that's enough." And she said, No, more." So I retreated. But Marge has remained a friend to this day. She's very old and feeble now, but Shan in particular communicates often with her. So life goes.
So when you travel to Europe, how did you travel and where did you first go to?
Oh, well, when I went back to the agency in Johannesburg and said, "Well, here's my pilot's license," they said, "Good. We'll send you for further training in Czechoslovakia, and then you'll go to Israel." And within a few weeks, I was on the way to Czechoslovakia, where we stopped off in Rome for a couple of weeks. There was a delay. And Paul, hurry me on if I'm talking too long. But I had a formative experience in Rome, which also influenced my life in another way. I came from a very ordinary, plain, uncultured family in Johannesburg. We never went to anything except the local cinema. But in Rome, seeking something to do, I noticed an ad for something at what was called the Terme di Caracalla, the Baths of Caracalla, which is obviously a Roman remained, beautiful stadium and converted into a modern open plan, no roof, with a big stage, a modern theatre for stage events, orchestra, opera, plays, and they were showing Aida. So for the very first time in my life, I went to an opera, saw Aida, magnificently performed, with a huge performance, so much so they had 2 elephants on the stage. And I have to say that left a happy mark on me for very many years. But then after that, we were sent off to Czechoslovakia, to a training base in Bratislava, which is today part of Slovakia. The training base was run by, well, training was carried out by ex-RAF pilots, that is, Czechs who had gone to Britain during the war and enrolled in the RAF. The planes we flew had the swastikas just painted over. They were still there underneath. But they were very good instructors. And, you know, Czechs, if they get angry, they swear in Russian. They got angry with me often. I know quite a few Russian swear words, which I will not repeat. But things were happening in Czechoslovakia at that time. It was ruled by a sort of social democratic party. But while we were in training in Bratislava, it got overthrown by the Communist Party, obviously with Russian backing. And the president, I've forgotten his name now, but the president at the time died a sudden death by, they said, walking out of a window. And so the communists took over. And although they were not particularly hostile to Israel, they were not in favor of the training, and they sent us home pretty soon. But sent us to Israel, I should say. But what I remember rather sadly is that several of the instructors approached us and said, "We're going to have a terrible future in this country with the communist government. Can we come with you?" Unfortunately, there was no way we could smuggle them with us. And I fear to think what happened to them later. Anyway, so it was in Czechoslovakia.
And what was it like when you arrived in Israel?
Well, in Israel, we hadn't completed our training in Czechoslovakia, but in any case, I wasn't a very good flyer. And so I was assigned to fly light aircraft, similar to the ones that I had flown before, but on reconnaissance and, I suppose, postal duties. Why? Because, well, under the UN plan, Israel had been invited, the Israeli state had been allocated in all of the southern half of Israel, that is the so-called Negev desert, and the city of Beersheba, the only big city, small city in it. But that part, at that time, cut off by Egyptian forces. So the only communication was by air. And I used to fly down regularly, taking the post, military and personal, and flying it back. And we'd always fly down in a light aircraft with 2 of us in the cabin. Not a Tiger Moth, but a cabin plane. And I flew down one night, and my colleague was going to fly back. But we were always warned there, be careful, this is a desert. If there's a wind, the sand may rise, and if it does, it may foul your carburetor and your engine will stop. And so test carefully. Well, he did test, my colleague did test carefully. And I saw myself that the revs came up to the minimum amount and over required. We duly took off, but after a little while, the engine stopped, presumably because of sand in the carburetor after all. But we were very, very fortunate because the lab was rather low-lying. It was nighttime, but we could barely see the outlines below there's no other interfering lights. And he did very well. We'd been instructed, if you're going to crash in these light planes, you can maybe save yourselves. When you get close to the ground, level out if you can, and then bank to the left, break off your one wing, bank to the right, break off the other, and that will slow down the machine enough so that you'll probably survive. And that's just what my colleague did. And amazingly, we were completely unhurt. And after a while, they came looking for us and found us. And I think one of the pictures, there it is, shows my pilot's license on the one hand and the two of us leaning on the crashed airplane. However, although we weren't hurt, and I felt probably a little bit casual about it, but it did make a mark on me. And I found that in the next few months, I made some dreadful mistakes flying. I thought, wow, this is not good. I better go and see an Air Force shrink, which I did. And he said, yeah, I think you better have a few weeks leave. And perhaps you better not do any more flying, which was probably wise. I discovered I wasn't cut out for flying. And so I spent 2 months on leave, which I took at a kibbutz. And the kibbutz was very good in many ways. It was a left-wing kibbutz with many of the people on it, those I knew from South Africa. And I liked them. But I did discover that I really didn't like farm work. And so I discovered that in very short succession, that I wasn't cut out to be a flyer and I wasn't cut out to be a farmer.
Very understandable. So then on your way, you decide to go back to study in South Africa, but on your way you go to England first.
Yes.
What was...
But in Israel, before I left it, I discovered in a bookshop in Tel Aviv a marvelous book. It's a very exciting title, Differential and Integral Calculus. No all clap, but I know for most people this would be of no interest at all. But this book was written by a chap called Richard Courant, and it is probably the best book on calculus that was ever written. And I must say, I bought it and I got absolutely engrossed. And later on, that's to where I turned to, and I think that's why.
That's why you decided to study maths at that point.
Yes. After I left Israel, I went back to Cape Town. I enrolled first in physics and maths course, but I wasn't doing too well in physics. So after a while, I specialized in maths. And of course, in Cape Town, there are the mountains again. And in Cape Town, I met on Table Mountain one Eugenie Cheesemont. Once I'd met Eugenie, I decided never to let her out of my sight if I could. And we duly got together and married some while later. And I think this picture shows Eugenie and I on a mountain with children, one of them being her son, Alistair, and the others being ours. And in Cape Town, after a while, I turned to maths and duly qualified with a BSc and then an MSc and finally a Ph.D. in maths. Not an interesting one like yours, Paul. You have a Ph.D. in a musician in London. It sounds much more interesting.
Well, different subjects, but
yes.
But then you after Cape Town, you go to Cambridge for a period of time.
Yes. Well, after I got the PhD in Cape Town, my professor there, Douglas Sears, recommended me for what is called the Jan Smuts Scholarship in memory of Jan Smuts, who was a great South African Prime Minister. I was given the scholarship to go to Cambridge for 2 years, with one curiosity that although I'd just done a PhD, to get the scholarship, you had to be registered for something. So I registered for another PhD. And so, of course, that's how it was. And we duly went to Cambridge with the family. Of course, being in Cambridge with the family is not quite like being an undergraduate, but it was a great experience all the same. And of course, Cambridge, this is my first stay in the UK, my first stay in Europe, is within reach. Cambridge is a very flat place, but it's within reach of the Cairngorms, the Skye, the Alps, all of which we duly discovered. And in order to facilitate this discovery, we bought a minibus, which we converted into a comfortable sleeper van. And Eugenie and I and the two children would go everywhere, up to Scotland, up to the Alps. We toured around in this, and there it is, and brings back many happy memories.
I'd say your academic career is somewhat dominated by mountaineering.
Yes, it was sometimes supplanted by mountaineering. But in Cambridge, I didn't let it entirely supplant the career, but I didn't finish my Ph.D. in the 2 years. And I think that was not because of excess of mountaineering. That was because when I was just ready to submit the thesis, I discovered a published paper with exactly what I was going to write. And so they agreed at Cambridge that I could have more time to do the PhD. And while I was in Cambridge, there was also there a Professor John L. Kelly, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of California in Berkeley, with an interesting history. During the McCarthy period, he was one of the many of the staff at Berkeley who had been dismissed despite having tenure because they refused to sign an oath of allegiance, as required by McCarthy. Not that he had anything against allegiance to the United States, but they thought on principle this was wrong. However, by that time, he'd been reinstated and decided to take some time off at Cambridge, and he worked in a field called functional analysis, which was the field where I was working. And John Kelly kindly invited me to come to Berkeley to work as an assistant professor, what we would call a junior lecturer there, which invitation I took with great enthusiasm.
You spent 2 years in California.
Yes. So Eugenie and I loaded ourselves and the children in our camper van onto a ship going from Liverpool to Montreal, as was the way in those days, unloaded the camper van and drove across Canada and the United States for the first time ever for both of us to arrive in Berkeley via Yellowstone Park to get a glimpse of the mountains. And so there we were in Berkeley. And that was another experience. And when I mentioned Yellowstone Park, that also reminds me that John Kelly had separated from his wife, Nancy, but we were invited to stay with Nancy when we first came to Berkeley. And then she came with us on a trip to Yellowstone, and that trip has remained always in my mind. And I think in my children's mind. Both of them are here. Neelam and Jay are somewhere in the hall. They've probably taken your donation on a card. And they were both kids then, of course. Anyway, we were all sleeping in the camper van, but it was pretty crowded, so Nancy chose to sleep outside on a camp bed. And during the night, she woke to find a bear licking her lips.
No, no.
The bear didn't do any harm, but of course gave her a terrible fright. And she said afterwards, you know, I had some cake and some chocolate to eat before I went to sleep, and I didn't clean my teeth. And Eugenie used this ever after as an incitement to the children to clean their teeth most carefully, which they did, of course. But while in Berkeley, there, I'm afraid, the Sierra Nevada began to take precedence over everything else. And while I did my lectures, I did not do any research. I did spend a lot of time in Yellowstone Park and other parts of the Sierra Nevada, and indeed did a first ascent of a route on the east face of Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in the continental United States. There's a picture of Mount Whitney. It's a pretty impressive looking place. And I think, oh yes, recently came across an article. Is that the ascent of Whitney? I think it is. Yes. Yeah. Detailing this. I should say, by the way, that I was always the second on these climbs. I was never a great climber, but I loved accompanying really good climbers. And I was second on the rope on many a fine climb. We had to bivouac somewhere on the way up, which was also interesting. But anyway, we did that. That was one of the many climbs I did in the Sierras. And we went there often with the children and Eugenie and all of us.
After 2 years,
After 2 years.
you decided to go back to England?
Well, after 2 years, the University of California decided that they did not want to renew my contract. They seemed to think I'd spent too little time doing research and too much time doing climbing. They didn't say the second. Anyway, the contract, I didn't get an offer. So instead, I sought a lectureship back in UK. I'm not quite sure why, but it was Manchester where I went to. And so I spent the next 2 years in Manchester. And of course, Manchester, there's some nearby scrambling and climbing, and we still had the minibus. And we still went up to Scotland, and we still went to the Alps. And I think we did some pretty good sea mountaineering during this period and later. A bit of difficulty sorting out exactly when and where. But after 2 years in Manchester, I got a letter from my old professor in Cape Town, Douglas Sears, who by that time had moved to become head of department in the Royal College in Nairobi. And he asked if I would like to come. And I thought, wow, yes, Kenya would be great. So we all duly moved to Kenya. I think without the minibus, as I can recall. No, we couldn't take the minibus there. There's not a very good shipway, and it would be pretty expensive to ship the minibus on a plane. But so we all did duly arrive in Nairobi, where we spent the next 2 years. And of course, if you're in Nairobi, there's a maths department, but there is Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro and many other things of note. And I spent a lot of time climbing there as ever. The Kilimanjaro, these mountains were too big for the smaller children, but Alistair came with them, some of the climbs on Mount Kenya. And they were two quite memorable events in a way. One of them was another first ascent of actually the second highest peak of Mount Kenya. The difference in height is very small, but it's called Nelion rather than Batyan. That was a climb with a man called Barry Cliff, who's a very good climber. And again, Barry was the leader and I the second. And again, we bivouacked on the way down, on the way up, on the rock face. It always seemed to happen. And I came across an article by Barry Cliff recently writing it up, and it was great. Anyway, there was that first ascent. And then, while I was there in Kenya, in December 1963, Kenya became independent, but being a British colony up to that time. But at midnight on the 12th of December, 1963, it became an independent nation. And on the following day, there was a ceremony in the stadium in Nairobi, which was run by Prince Philip and the forthcoming president of Kenya. And the Mountain Club of Kenya decided that they must hoist a flag on the top of Mount Kenya on the eve of independence. So I was part of a Mountain Club party and who were doing this. And the eventual party to reach the top was Robert Chambers, myself, and Kisson Munyao, who was the only African who was a competent climber at that time. It's not that the club had excluded blacks, but at least not recently. They had been previously excluded, but not many had reached that sort of standard at that time. So Kisson was great, and there he is, with the flag on top of Mount Kenya. And the next day, we climbed down the mountain, day and night, of course, and early morning, and a helicopter arrived to uplift Kissoy and take him straight to the stadium to have his hand shook by Prince Philip and the president. And this had a sort of a sequel, two sequels, in fact. Kissoy was not at first generally recognized, but he was later acclaimed. And when he died in 2009, there was a state funeral for him. And Robert and I were invited to the funeral, and with the president of Kenya at that time. I don't think I've got a picture of it, but there is one somewhere. And that was good. And in 2013, that is 50 years after Kenya became independent, there was the Mountain Club decided to have a memorial climb of Mount Kenya, to which Robert and I were invited. Well, we were both too old to go to the top, but we both got fairly high, Robert a bit higher than me, and Alistair and Neelam came with us, which was great. And it also enabled me then to visit, by that time I was running EDA, and to visit an EDA project there, which we'll perhaps get on to a bit later.
Yeah. Wow. So after Kenya, you decided to come back to the UK, to England.
Indeed.
In London, Sussex.
Indeed. I came back from Kenya, but I'm afraid that Eugenia and I had split up by that time. And in England, I was with Hilda Marie Hendricks, who I had met in Kenya. And we established ourselves in London, but I was working in Sussex. We were in London because her two children, two of whom are in the picture there with Neelam and with Michael and Jacqueline, as they were then called. They were staying with their father in London, but visiting Hilda Marie, so it was better for her to be in London. So I commuted down to Sussex regularly, and was in Sussex for 2 years, or rather London, working in Sussex for 2 years. And then I saw an advert for a strange position, doing something called pattern recognition. I'd wondered what it was, so I had a read. It seemed that the Medical Research Council's Human Genetics Unit, which was based at the Western General Hospital here in Edinburgh, was looking for somebody to start a pattern recognition unit. And what patterns were they supposed to recognize? They were supposed to recognize patterns of chromosomes in slides made from amniotic fluid samples from pregnant women, with the aim of detecting chromosome abnormalities, which would enable you to assess whether the fetus was suffering from Down syndrome or other more complicated syndromes. And the idea was to devise an automatic system to recognize the chromosomes. Well, I said, that's interesting. I'd had some computer experience then, but not much. But I applied for the job with no experience in pattern recognition. Then no one else had any experience in pattern recognition either. So at that time, I duly got the job and worked for the MRC for 25 years after that, doing pattern recognition, a discipline which gradually got established, and we did develop some useful things, and I think made some contributions to the science. And now all of the work that we did, all of the work many other people did, which are get encapsulated not in the monstrous tall bus-sized machines we used at first, but on your phone. You can probably get more advanced system on your phone for nothing these days, but it cost a great deal of effort to develop those systems.
How did you come to Edinburgh?
Well, the unit I was working for actually was based in Edinburgh, but at first we worked in London. And I think that one of my colleagues there might be here tonight. Jim, I'm not sure. And then we moved to Edinburgh after 5 years. Certainly one of my Edinburgh colleagues is here. And we worked there for a long time. We eventually did produce a working system. And then the unit went on to do other tasks in pattern recognition, such as creating an atlas of mouse genetics and such like. But of course, in Edinburgh, there are other things than the MRC. For one thing, there is Arthur's Seat and the Pentlands, And so I think that picture is of me in the lab, I suppose. This was a revelation, to have literally a small mountain, but a mountain right in the town where you live. This was wonderful. And so I was a very frequent visitor, and so were the rest of my family at that time. And I'm afraid that my marriage with Hilda Marie broke up too after a while. And by the time we came to Edinburgh, it was on the rocks, and we separated. And shortly after that, I met one Jan Bell, Professor Dr. Jan Bell, who's here tonight, working a carbon machine, I think. And she was a colleague of mine in the MRC unit. And I remember she gave a lecture. I was studying embryology at the time. I gave a lecture on embryo pathology, showing the most horrific slides. Her eyes were fascinated. And somehow or other, we found ourselves together and have been together ever since. And Jan is not a great walker or hiker, but as the previous slides showed, such is the power of love. She followed me up not only Arthur's Seat and the Pentlands, but even the Cairngorms and the mountains in Skye and some in the Alps and in Cape Town and everywhere. And thank you for that, Jan.
Now, as I understand it, when you're coming up to retirement, 1992, 93, you're planning a holiday in Greece.
That's
Crete. And you're thinking, we're going to have this lovely retirement holiday. What happens?
That's quite right, Paul. We'd been to Crete several times, of course, to walk over the White Mountains there. And we were planning to go again. And this was the autumn of 1992, when Yugoslavia was breaking up, and Serbia was trying to prevent the other countries, like Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo, from leaving. And it had developed into a war, short-term war in some cases. The war with Croatia was very violent, but I think by that time had almost come to an end. But the war in Bosnia continued, and that was a kind of three-sided war, with the Bosnian Croats siding against the Bosnian Serbs, but both of them against the Bosniaks. And the only people wanting the unity of Bosnia were the Muslim Bosniaks and the Christians who lived in Sarajevo and really had no particular axe to grind with any religion, but wanted Bosnia to be independent. And the results were horrifying. There were events occurred in Bosnia which we hadn't seen in Europe since World War II. Concentration camps, death trains, you name it, everything. And Jan and I thought, well, can we really go on holiday to a few hundred miles away from all this horror? And by chance, we saw in the newspaper an article about a man living in London, living in Dover actually, who was in the habit of driving his big van down to Zagreb every now and again with all the medical or other aid he could find to help refugees, mainly Croatian refugees in Zagreb. And so we agreed we'd phone him up, see if we could come with, which we did. And he said, oh, that's great. Meet me in Dover 2 weeks' time. See you there, 11 o'clock Saturday. And we said, what? However, we got ourselves together a little bit. Jan was a member of an elder in St. Andrew's St. George's Church at that time. She spoke to the church. I spoke in my workplace. I hadn't retired yet, though some thought I had. No, not yet. And within a few weeks, we had another pair coming with us. The Edinburgh City Council had loaned us a trailer to take behind our camper van. We'd been donated a very valuable load of of drugs and other medical equipment. The school of our partners on the trip, their son had spoken in the school, and the school had collected £1,000 and 1,000 blankets, and we were on our way to Zagreb, not knowing thing about what we were doing. We were led by our guide to Zagreb. He led us to a nice house in a suburb where we could have dormitory accommodation. We found our way to the dormitory, and then we were surprised to hear chanting coming from the next door dormitory. So we went to have a look and found, to our great surprise and astonishment, that there was a huge picture of an Indian guru on the wall. Sai Baba is his name. And this was a Sai Baba refuge, or rather I should say a Sai Baba headquarters, where they met and gathered and sang and meditated to Sai Baba. We were amazed and astonished. Hadn't been what we expected in Zagreb, but found they were very nice people. And they helped and guided us, and they took us to meet some refugees. And we were glad to have met them. And while we were there, we were also, I think we had a letter from the church here to the Catholic Church in Zagreb. And we took this letter, and we were introduced to a nun who spoke English with a Srine and Croatian accent, if you can imagine. But she took us and showed us refugee camps, but she also took us to an area which had been occupied by the Serbs. And there we saw firsthand, for the first time in our lives, something we couldn't imagine. That is the result of ethnic cleansing. Mile after mile of deserted villages where almost every house had been blown up. Apparently the technique was to put a gas cylinder on the ground floor, put a candle on the top floor, close the door and go away. And when the gas reached the top floor, bang, more or less destroyed the house. So the houses were pretty much destroyed. But the churches, because the Serbs destroyed the Catholic churches, and I dare say the Croats destroyed the Orthodox ones, but I hadn't evidence of that. And they both destroyed the Muslim churches wherever they were, which of course left a mark, an indelible one. And when we got back to Edinburgh, we didn't know, we hadn't intended more than one convoy, but what with what we'd seen, and another phenomenon which we didn't expect. When we got back, we were deluged with people who were saying, "Can we help? Could we go on again? Could we go out with you? Come on, you can't stop now." And we were amazed then, as we've been amazed ever since, by the readiness of people to help others, especially if it's practical help. Giving money, we all do that a bit, but if you could help in a real personal way, it's entirely different. And to this day, I continue to be astonished at what our wonderful volunteers do in all respects. For example, in our warehouse down in Granton, where they work in, it's a miserable place without proper heating and so on, but they work in all weathers, doing the hardest of work, and everybody's cheerful and like it. And so, instead of being one convoy, we did another. And by the end of the year, we decided, we had formed an organization which we called Edinburgh Direct Aid. And so that led to registration in February that year. And in December, we took our first ever convoy to Sarajevo. And there's, I think, a distant picture of Sarajevo as a scene from one of the hills, I think. Sarajevo at that time was besieged on all sides. Sarajevo is surrounded by hills, as you can see, and the Serbs occupied all the surrounding hills. And from time to time would lease an artillery bombardment. And from time to time would machine gun people in the streets. So there was nowhere safe in Sarajevo. And you had to be very careful where you walked. It was also a city which had very little water, very erratic electricity, still had some gas supplies, because why? Because the gas was from Russia, and Russia didn't want to lose the income, and so the Serbs didn't cut it off completely. But we got there with 4 vehicles this time, and 3 other groups and Jeanne and I, and our son Gerard, Jeanne's son Gerard, who was then 22, I think, and wanted to be a reporter, so he wanted to come. Not that he ever became a reporter, but still. So we were led to Sarajevo Hospital. If you can imagine a hospital with none but the most basic electricity supplies for the emergency wards only, hardly any water, broken windows. But it had a safe shelter to which we were led. The toilets were not up to much, you can imagine, but still it was overnight. And so, say that is another thing that left a lasting mark. And while there, on arrival actually, we met somebody called Maureen Checkers, who's a British woman married to a Sarajevan doctor. And Maureen became a fast friend and guide and mentor because she began to work for UNHCR. And in all the subsequent convoys we took to Sarajevo, we were always on the phone, first of all, when it was walkie-talkies, later on the phone to her first. And that was a great help then and later.
I was going to ask, I mean, it must have raised a few eyebrows amongst the authorities, thinking, you know, what are these people doing driving to Sarajevo with 4 lorries? And did you get any advice, or what was the sort of Foreign Office guidance at the time around Sarajevo, and how did you deal with that?
Very simple, don't go there.
Yeah.
As is their advice today in Lebanon, don't go there. No, I'm afraid if you followed the Foreign Office advice, you would never go any of these places. Interestingly, though, at that time, we had a visit from 2 gentlemen who said they were very interested in volunteering for Edinburgh Direct Aid and wanted to know all about us. And we had a long conversation, never saw them again. I'm sure they were from MI5, wanted to know what we were up to.
And were there other groups doing anything like this at the time? I mean, were there any other groups doing anything like this at the time? Or?
Yes, there were many groups doing something like this. Of course, Edinburgh Direct Aid on its own cannot do very much. But as part of a community of people taking aid, I think the aid was quite substantial. And you could get into Sarajevo, even though it was besieged on all sides. At that time, if you gave 1/3 of your aid to the besiegers, which we hated doing, but it was a way of doing it. And so we continued driving convoys to Sarajevo. Of course, in 1993, we did a few convoys, and I think it was probably our 3rd or 4th convoy. It was not to Sarajevo, but to Bosnia. And a couple called Alan and Christine Whitcutt came with us. This was their first experience of convoy work. And Alan was a truck driver, so, you know, very useful indeed. And Christine was a school teacher, but was great on the convoys. And they came out on the next convoy to Sarajevo as well. But Sarajevo was always pretty dangerous. And on the way out, Christine was hit by a bullet from a sniper. He was in a flak jacket in a seat of a truck. But actually, she had just leaned forward at that moment. Well, it just came in through the armpit of the black jacket into her chest and killed her. And we didn't realize it, but she had died almost instantaneously. And of course, this was for Edinburgh Direct Aid, a most terrible event. And I suppose that we might well have given it up at that stage, except for Alan. Alan Whitcutt said, "We knew the risk. Christine knew the risk. Christine would not have liked you to give it up. She would have liked you to continue, so let us continue." So we did. So we continued taking convoys to Sarajevo. And of course, many other places in Bosnia. At that time, we were taking fairly large convoys. The first convoy to Sarajevo was quite small, but after that, it was 8 or 10 trucks some of them quite big trucks. And we had a lot of public support, and we were very glad to be able to do it. And then there was another event, not nearly as catastrophic as the loss of Christine, but in the following year, I think it was July '94, if I remember right, though I might not have got the month quite right. Things had changed somewhat. We were able to get to Sarajevo at that time by taking a route over a mountain called Mount Igman, which was partially controlled by the Bosniaks and partly by the UN. And going over Mount Igman, you could get to the Bosnian side of the airport. The airport itself was controlled by the UN. And you could cross the airport at night. You were not supposed to, but you could. And so you could avoid going through Serb lines altogether. And there was also a tunnel which the Bosniaks had built under the airport where people could go to and fro. Not trucks, of course, but that did enable ordinary civilians to escape or to enter. But we had now taken a few convoys from the Mount Igman route. But on one of these, which I was leading, I didn't lead all the convoys by any means, but I was in a jeep driven by David Reeks, a wonderful volunteer who died last year. And I think we had about 10 trucks. And the rearmost truck was driven by one Andy Sutherland, a very good man who worked with us a long time. And we'd been advised by the UNHCR to wait, and then they said, well, you can probably go now. So we went now, but UN didn't have it quite right. Well, how could they? And there was a barrage of fire from a long-distance machine gun fire from the Serb side. But it hit at random different places, and some bullets landed in Andy's truck. Andy lost control for a minute, drove off the road. The truck overturned and slid quite a way down the mountain. But miraculously, Andy was unhurt. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the other end of the convoy, nearing the bottom of the mountain, a bullet came through the windscreen and hit me. And fortunately, like Christine, I was wearing a flak jacket, but fortunately for me, unlike her, the bullet was coming from the front, hit the flak jacket, was deflected, but still went into my chest, just above the heart. But it was a severe wound, but as you see, I survived. David Reeks drove me to the nearest Umprafor point, and they were very helpful, French Umprafor, and drove me to the Umprafor hospital in Sarajevo, where I was dealt with and evacuated to Zagreb the next day. Meanwhile, Andy had climbed back up to the road, but the road was still under fire. There was no transport there. We were fortunately in walkie-talkie communication. Our people asked the same French Umprafor if they would take one of their armored vehicles and go and fetch him, and they declined. So two of our volunteers in an unarmored vehicle went to fetch him, and they were lucky, and they all came down safely. And, well, that was that. 2 months later, Andy and I, just to make sure that we were still up to it, we went back to Sarajevo, took care to be in a partially armored vehicle, at least this time. And so the story continued.
When the war finished in 1995, what happened with EDA? Did you carry on visiting the countries, or did EDA have a bit of a rest?
Well, as you say, the war came in 2005, but the need did not come to an end. And so we continued running convoys with aid of all sorts. But in addition to that, we found that there were a lot of refugees living in, some in Edinburgh, but all over the place, some in London, who came from a small town called Ključ, which is in Bosnia, not very far from the Croatian border. And they could go back to their homes, but their homes had been ransacked and pillaged of everything that was movable, including windows and doors. They were hopeless to live in as they were. So we got involved first in helping them return to their country. And then we thought, gosh, all these homes need repair. What can be done? So we applied to UNHCR for some funds, and to our surprise, were given, I think, about 100,000, and with no previous experience whatsoever in reconstruction, we set up a project which was led wonderfully by one Liz McLaughlin, who had previously done various things, such as running a Café de Move On in Edinburgh, but had been wonderful on the convoys. Certainly no building experience, but she ran this project extremely well. And although we did lose a bit of money in it, we went on to make other applications, which we didn't lose on, but came out even as we should, which were also led by Les. And eventually, after a year or so, we were really working big time, and the funding was going up to several million. And in fact, one year, we believe we built more or repaired more houses than Wimpy built in that year. So we were quite pleased with ourselves. So we continued with some aid work and some reconstruction work for several years after that.
Yeah. And then in 1998, the war starts in Kosovo. Must have been
that is right.
A shock. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm afraid the Yugoslav War of Independence had many ramifications, and the war in Kosovo was one of them, because Kosovo also wanted to break away. And the Kosovans were demonstrating and rioting, and they were suppressed very brutally. And it met the world's attention with hundreds of thousands of Kosovars leaving Kosovo to go to Albania, but as refugees. And so, of course, we decided we must try to help there as well. But at that time, we teamed up with other Scottish charities to form a small group called the Scottish Charities Kosovo Alliance, which had 5 Scottish and I think 1 Sussex-based charity in it. And of course, that made us much larger than we'd ever been before. And we were able to take huge road convoys, many of them led by David Weeks, who I've mentioned, and even to hire a 1,000-ton ship and fill that and send it. Where we sent it to was a place called Durrës, a port in Albania, which served as the ingress port to Kosovo at that time. Well, we couldn't get into Kosovo at that time, and that's where the Albanian refugees were. So we established a base there. We hired a building and a warehouse. We later on found that the half of the building that we hired was only half. The other half was a brothel, but we didn't know that at the time. We also found that thievery was almost a way of life, and found it most difficult to keep our stuff, even though the Italian Umpro was there and sent soldiers to protect our trucks from thievery. But when kids come running in and snitch, what's a soldier going to do? So we just had to live with it, really. But fairly soon, NATO took action, and after a short war against Serbia, which involved a bit of bombing of Belgrade even, actually, but the Serbs agreed to leave Kosovo. And so NATO moved into Kosovo, and shortly after, charities were allowed to move there. And so we followed. And in discussion with UNHCR, we were assigned the possibility of working in a place called Mitrovica, which is on the border with Serbia in the north, and, is still in the news to this day as a trouble spot between the Serbs and the Kosovans, because the Serbs on the north part of Mitrovica, the Kosovans on the south. But we established a base there, and were able to get our goods there through, first via Durrës, but also other routes through Montenegro and through Greece and Montenegro, and worked there for some years. But that project was led by somebody called Stephanie Wolfe-Murray, a name which may be familiar to some of you as the founder of the Whatgate Press in Edinburgh, the most successful independent publisher Edinburgh's ever had, working to this day. Stephanie's sons worked in aid work as well, and we worked with their organizations cooperatively. And that's also where we met one Maggie Tukey, who became after that our all-purpose Wonder Woman. And whenever we had a difficult job to do, there was Maggie in the front. That has continued to this day. Stephanie herself worked for us for a lot, worked in Kosovo, led the project there, including a reconstruction phase, which was also pretty successful. I think the picture shows a house not in Kosovo, but in Bosnia, the kind of thing which, I think this was exceptional. That might have been a school reconstructed or a school constructed. But anyway, that's the kind of thing which we actually did. And though most of it was house repair rather than reconstruction. Stephanie died a few years ago, but we maintained our friendship and contact always.
Then in 2005, you get involved in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Tell us how that came about, and was that, it feels like a big step away from the Balkans.
Indeed. Well, we did take a step away from the Balkans. In fact, at about that time, we formally changed our constitution. It had read initially about aid to the Balkans, but subject to the trustees' decision. But we changed our constitution to read that we will provide aid anywhere where people are suffering as a result of either man-made or natural catastrophes, and where we can find an effective niche to work in. And that's what we've done ever since. And in 2005, from 2005 to 2007, I think, there were a series of events. The first was the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, which did great damage in Sri Lanka, amongst other places. And we had some connection with people there, which led us to mount a small project there. And then there were the earthquake and floods in Pakistan, which did huge damage. So we sent some containers and various people to Pakistan. Amongst the people going to Pakistan were Maggie, who I mentioned, and John Hume Robertson, who was the MP for East Lothian and then became SNP for East Lothian, and whom we had actually met in Bosnia when he was on a parliamentary visiting committee at one of the British bases where our trucks sheltered overnight, because their mission was to protect aid convoys, which we, of course, took advantage of. And John and Maggie visited Pakistan several times, and we established, on their advice, several projects. One of them was to help clinics which had been damaged in the earthquake, to repair them, or in one case, in a place called Konkan, to actually rebuild the clinic because it had been utterly destroyed. Konkan is a town in the near a place called Mitrovica, which is controlled by Pakistan, but it's in the area of dispute between Pakistan and India. And the Konkan is about 5,000 feet altitude. It's possibly 5,000 feet altitude, but rather higher than Mitrovica. And the road to it is extremely bad. It's extremely hilly and precipitous. There are many accidents on it. And we went up there, Maggie and John went up there with trepidation, but recommended that we do something about the clinic. What they decided to do was something quite surprising. We'd sent out some containers. Generally, when you send a container, that's the end of it. The container goes back to the shipper. But you can buy the container if you want and have it left on site. And we thought we could use a container or two as a base. And Maggie made a plan to convert the container into a clinic by insulating the walls, providing roof insulation, putting in windows, plumbing, the lot. And all this was done where the container was parked near the airfield in Abbottabad. We found out later that we were about 200 yards from where Osama bin Laden was hiding out. We were none the wiser. Anyway, the container was duly converted. Then there was the problem of getting it to Konkan. And Maggie hadn't thought it through completely. We could never get it up that road. But she had a brainwave. We'd go to the UNHCR helicopter base because they had an aid base there. And they had some of the biggest helicopters in the world, Russian-made helicopters, which were fully capable of carrying a clinic, which you see in the picture. And she went along there and was more or less told to get lost. However, she was with a colleague who was from South Africa, and he heard that some of the pilots talking and recognized an Afrikaans accent. And so he said to them, which means, "How you doing, brother?" And the response was immediate, and surprise, surprise, they said, "Wes, we'll take your container." And that's how the world works, I guess. And it was a most dramatic event with this container appearing over the horizon, and Maggie and the whole population of the village turned out to greet it. And it, needless to say, it didn't land in quite the right place, but it wasn't deposited in quite the right place. But we've got another photo, not shown here, of all the men of the village and big ropes attached to the container, pulling it to where we wanted to go. And so the clinic was established. And it was duly recognized by the Department of Health and staffed. And while Maggie was there at a later visit, it was running, and she found herself for the first time in her life delivering, and only time, helping deliver a baby. And unbelievably, 2 months ago, she visited Pakistan, revisited this clinic, and found to her joy and delight, and our joy and delight, that it was up and running, remembered EDA fondly, recognized by the Department of Health as a good facility, and some of the other clinics. As a matter of fact, a man who was Minister of Health at that time recently visited the UK and came and stayed overnight with us. It was all great.
Wow. Incredible story of ingenuity, really. Now, we're under a little bit of time pressure. We've got a few more projects to talk about. Tell us very briefly about Kenya, when you went back to Kenya.
Well, yes, Kenya was one of the places which suffered, in which AIDS hit very badly, especially in towns used by truckies, you can imagine. And one of them was in Kisumu. And there were many widows, people whose husbands had died, often children, wives had died too of AIDS, and children were being looked after by grandparents. And somebody that a colleague, another friendly organization knew, had started a relief project for them. And it was the Kisumu AIDS Widows Project. And we got, first of all, slightly involved, and then a bit more. Eventually, we did quite a lot for them. And some of our people, including in particular John Hume Robertson, I've mentioned, and his son Patrick, went out and helped them establish actually he built a borehole for them and also helped reroute the electricity. But I mention that in particular because John Hume Robinson's son Patrick died very sadly of a cancer as a young man just a few months ago. And he is remembered very fondly by us, especially for his work in Kisumu.
Yeah.
And in a small way, that project continues to this day. We send out a small amounts of money every year where widows can gather for a lunch every now and again, and that helps them a bit.
And I think after Kenya, in 2009, there was in bombardment of Gaza.
There was indeed. In 2009, Bosnia was, Gaza was heavily bombed by Israel. Nothing like what is happening today, but nevertheless heavily enough to attract world attention. And as a result, we got together with not the Scottish Parliament as such, but with volunteers from the Scottish Parliament and some people, volunteers from the Central Mosque in Glasgow, and agreed that we would try to send medical aid there. And the party eventually comprised Colin Cooper, who's shown in one of the pictures here, myself, Pauline McNeill from the Scottish Parliament, 2 volunteers from the Glasgow Central Mosque. And we'd assured ourselves a negotiation with the British Embassy in Cairo, which I might say was most unhelpful, but nevertheless we were assured that we could do it, and managed to send some aid by air, and went to Cairo, bought more aid there, and hired a truck, the one you see in the picture, which we loaded up with the medical aid sent by air and the medical aid bought in Cairo, and took ourselves to the border, the present border of Gaza. But we got in, to our surprise, and met there many people particularly in the medical world. One of them was a Dr. Idiagi, who runs he runs one of a number of small clinics, which we approved of very much. And there in the picture is, I think, Scottish medical doctor getting together with Gazan medical doctor. And we made that contact, which lasted, and another contact with another medic called Kamis Elesi. And Colin, who is here tonight, a great enthusiast for palliative care, was one of the things he helped establish in Edinburgh. And he found there wasn't anything like that in Gaza. And he got Kamis Elesi interested, other medics interested. When he came back to Edinburgh, he got the University of Edinburgh interested. And so a palliative care training and working project was set up in Gaza, which is running to the present day. Well, I should modify that. I don't know if anything is running. It was running until the present day. And I've been in touch with Hamis recently. He's still alive. He said just one thing: can you help me get out? Of course, I know no way of helping him get out. So Gaza leaves me most dreadfully saddened, as does all of us.
Yeah, indeed. Then I think we should talk about the project in Lebanon, which is
yes,
a
indeed.
big project. And
it's our largest project over the last 10 years now, has been in Lebanon. Again, the ground was surveyed by Maggie and John Hume Robertson, who, when the millions began fleeing from persecution outside Syria, they went around, visited camps in Turkey and then in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, they went around in the Bekaa Valley looking at various sites, and they came to a place called Arsal, which is high in the hills above the valley. It's actually about 20 miles from border with Syria, but there's nothing between the town and the border except fields and orchards. And when the regime began bombing the border villages, which they did in order to clear the way for them to communicate from north to south, they bombed indiscriminately, of course, and the villagers began fleeing. And on the day which John and Maggie arrived in Arsal, tens of thousands of refugees were crossing the border from Syria into Arsal. And they soon realized that a huge number of refugees, actually 70,000, had come or were coming to Arsal, whose population was only 35,000. And at that time, there were no other aid agencies working there. It seemed possible that we could. They discussed it with a few people, recommended it to us when they got back to Edinburgh, and we agreed, let's go for it. And so we established a base in Arsal. And that base is going to this day. And this base is now a center. We soon established a center from which we run a school, which we built, and a school which is run by Syrian teachers. And when I say school, I should qualify it. The Lebanese government does not allow Syrian teachers, not allow Syrians to work as teachers, and therefore Syrian refugees can't teach in a school. This form has been not enforced, but recently it has been. So our school is now not a school, it's the Scottish Training Centre, under which name it is allowed to continue. and it continues with enthusiasm. The centre also runs something called the Medelssohn Project, which is a centre for children with special needs. It runs vocational training, it runs a sewing workshop, it runs emergency services, and it's staffed by refugees. And I should say perhaps that, well, we claim to be an all-volunteer organisation. That is to say, so far as Scottish volunteers are concerned, or anybody in this country, anybody in the committee or trustees, but for refugees working for us, they are paid. And we have a group in Arsal, which works very well, run by a very competent man called Nabil Khalouf, who is very good at organizing all sorts of things. And I should mention perhaps that he worked in the Foreign Office in Syria and then absconded. So he, under no circumstances, could go back to Syria. He'll be immediately arrested. Though his family, he has his mother there who still visits with his handicapped son, sometimes can visit where he is. His father and part of their family have emigrated to Sweden, but he and his wife are still in Arsal. And the project there runs the various things I've mentioned. Also, more recently, we've set up a solar project which replaces the diesel power used by a group of 5 cooperating farms to run their irrigation system. Replacing the diesel power from our point of view, from an ecological perspective, from their point of view, simply because diesel is so expensive now. It's gone through the roof. And so they were very glad to have the possibility of replacing it with solar. We put in a big solar installation on condition that we can use some of the water for domestic use in the houses and tents which are within gravitational reach from the farms. So we provide water for about 200 families from this project, which is entirely solar powered, and it's to everybody's advantage. And having done this, we set about creating other solar projects. We've put in solar power for our centre, for schools and so on. And one of them, an unexpected one, we were approached by the police saying, we can't afford electricity anymore, can you help us? Well, and they're right, the police are almost destitute. This is because the Bosnian pound has so hyperinflated that it's worthless, almost. And the police, of course, are funded in Bosnian pounds.
The Lebanese.
Sorry, excuse me, yeah. Thank you, for Lebanese pounds. And actually, the police in us are pretty good. They are fair. They do not discriminate between refugees and locals. And so we said, we'll have a look-see. And one of our members, committee member at that time, was David Hamilton, who was chair of the Scottish Police Federation. And David said, I'll ask the Police Federation, which he did. And they agreed to fund it. So the police station now has solar power, courtesy of the Scottish Police Federation.
Yeah.
And David, by the way, is now Information Commissioner for Scotland. So a good man to know, but take care if you're sending illicit emails.
We should point out, I think at this point, that there's a wonderful link here as well with the Music Hub here in Stockbridge, and that 2 of your volunteers in Lebanon have been Nigel Osborne, the composer who many of us know, and
yes,
pioneer of music projects in war zones.
Thank you.
And of course, Clear, who runs the Stockbridge Music Hub, has worked in the Lebanese music program.
Indeed, yes. I was about to mention that.
Yeah.
Actually, but so, thank you for the reminder.
Feel free to chat to Clear more about that afterwards. And then finally, because I realise we're taking a long time, longer than I thought, but it's such an interesting story. I think this needs time to be told. Let's talk about Ukraine and how you got involved there.
Could I just say a word more about Arsal?
Sure.
I'm very glad you mentioned Nigel and Clear, because they have transformed things in Arsal in 2 ways. One way is they brought Nigel and Clear are both experts in music for children, and they brought music and joy to the children in Arsal in a way they've never known before. both in the school and the disabled centre. They've also run a music festival for all children in the Bekaa Valley, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But not only that, Nigel is a man of many skills. And one of the things we're doing in Nassau is we've funded a project, or loan funded a project, to convert waste sheep fleeces into insulation. And it's excellent. The insulation is fireproof, wonderful. And Nigel has done all the scientific testing of that, which is great. But Ukraine, as you say.
Yeah.
Which
we'll return to Nigel another evening, because Nigel's such a fascinating character. I think we need to run another event for Nigel, but we'll come back to that.
You're right.
But yes, Ukraine.
Ukraine. Well, when hostilities in Ukraine broke out, within a few weeks, Maggie was there. Within a few weeks later, David Hamilton was there. And that has developed, and various volunteers have gone out since, and developed from working on the border to working inside Ukraine. And what we've done is we have delivered, generally speaking, in our view, it's not worth sending goods from this country, because you can buy everything in the main centers in Ukraine. It helps their economy too if you buy them there. So our people buy goods in the safer, larger centers and distribute them to people who are in the centers under threat, who've been bombarded, whose houses have been destroyed, and who are in great need of this and that. And we deliver everything from food to medicines to wood if that's required, to building materials if those are required. In addition to which, we've delivered 2 vehicles. Well, we bought 1 vehicle there, which is for the use of their NGOs, an NGO we've partnered with there, or our people if they're visiting, and delivered another. In particular, David Hamilton arranged for the donation of a wonderful camper van, not like ours, well, a bit like ours actually, but converted into a very nice office, which is now being used by a child therapy project, which Nigel contacted because they are associated with the music therapy that he delivers training for. And he and Cleo have been out to Ukraine several times. And so the project, the music project is still running in Sarajevo. The vehicles are still running in, sorry, I keep saying Sarajevo, in Ukraine. And our work in Ukraine will continue.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking us through such a remarkable story. Maybe to conclude, we should do 2 things. One is to say, let's talk about what happens next with EDA, and how do you see the future for it, and what does it need to continue?
Well, Edinburgh Direct Aid recently changed its of organisation, so we now organise this so-called Scottish Incorporated charity, which means that there were 2 tiers of membership only. There are 2 tiers only. They're the members and the board are also the trustees, which is different from how it was before. And that will continue more or less as EDA did. But in terms of leadership, I'm, as you all can see only too plainly, I'm very old. It's time I retired. And I've been wanting to hand on the torch for some time. But you know, I find it difficult. I do not find it easy, and I find it I know that the organization has got to change when handed on, but do I like it? I do not. Nevertheless, within the next year, I surely must hand over. And I think Jourdan, who is deputy chair, will also hand over sometime next year. But I'm sure we will find somebody of the right sort, which may still do it very differently, but somebody who will make a success of Edinburgh Direct Aid International in the future.
Maybe somebody here. So
maybe somebody here, indeed.
Do speak afterwards, yeah, to Denis if you have any ideas. And I think just at the end, we have one photo of your whole family. I want to bring that up, and you can just tell us, introduce us to your family very briefly, and then I think we can finish and we can chat informally afterwards and enjoy some more food. Yeah.
Well, in spite of remarriage, two divorces, 3 marriages, nevertheless, we seem to have a family which likes a big family, an extended family where people get together and like being with each other. And last summer, we had a great get-together at a place called Kippelaw in Yorkshire, where amazingly for 5 days consecutively the sun shone, the weather was great, everybody got together. Eugenie's children, Hilda's children, Jan's children, my children, and we all had a great time. That's it.
Wow, that's an amazing photo. Well, please join me in saying a big thank you to Denis for telling us his story.
Thank you, folks.
And no event with Denis would be complete without just saying that there is obviously some fundraising for EDA tonight. We have some ways of making donations, but I think even more important than that, if we have ideas about how to really sort of support EDA in the future, please do come and talk to Denis and other members of EDA in the room. So thank you very much for coming along tonight, and what a wonderful story.
Thank you, Paul.